Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of the Endless Spiral podcast. You're all very welcome. As always, I am your host, Keith Russell. On this episode, I am joined by Barry Murphy of BodyWhys. So today we're going to be talking about eating disorders. If you're a little unfamiliar about BodyWhys, which I'm sure you know who they are, but if you're not, their mission is to ensure support, awareness, and understanding of eating disorders amongst the wider community, as well as advocating for the rights and healthcare needs of people affected by eating disorders. BodyWhys was founded in 1995 and is a national voluntary organisation supporting people affected by eating disorders. Now, that's my little speech out of the way. I'm going to bring Barry in. So, Barry, thanks very much for coming on today. I really appreciate you giving up your time for this topic.
Absolutely, Keith. Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Good. How are you anyway? You keeping well?
Yeah, all good. Another week is nearly over. It's unbelievable that we're this far into the year, September.
Yeah, and at this stage, I think every month just merges into the next. So I couldn't even tell you what day it is. I think it's Thursday, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Right, Barry. So as we said at the beginning, there you are from BodyWhys. So just in case anyone is a little unfamiliar about yourselves, do you want to just kind of give a little bit of an intro into maybe yourself and what you do and what BodyWhys does and is?
Yeah, so I'm the research policy officer here. Only in the last couple of weeks. I was previously communications for over 9 years, so we've a new person in communications now. And essentially, BodyWhys was set up in 1995 as the National Voluntary Association for People Affected by Eating Disorders. So at the time, there were very little services really for people, and it was kind of a group of parents came together and established it. And so over the course of the past number of years, then we've expanded that to include things like online support groups. We've had an email service since 2005, and then our family program, which has been running since 2014. We also do things like school talks, which we've been doing since 2009. We've worked a lot as well. I did in my previous role with kind of the social media companies, because they all have an Irish presence or European headquarters in Dublin.
Yeah.
And some of the kind of harmful content that kind of comes up there. We've done a lot of webinar type stuff as well. This year, we did a piece on autism and eating disorders, did a 3-part series, coach education series around athletics coaches and kind of the issues they might encounter amongst their athletes. So it's not just kind of core support we do, but we do a lot of other stuff as well.
Yeah, wow. I mean, God, you have so much stuff there that I wasn't even aware of. That's absolutely fantastic. I just wanted to pick up on just something you said about the school talks there. Are they secondary schools or primary schools, or are they mixed schools? Or
yeah, it's very much secondary, but there are primary school lesson plans in the pipeline. So last October 2020, we launched a specific body image website around kind of that whole issue. And it's not just eating disorders we talk about in schools, but it can be body image as well. And sometimes it comes from, there's a concern in the school that the staff have picked up on, or else it's just a teacher might have an interest in the issue as a whole. So we're very measured in how we approach that whole issue, because you have to take it quite good care in how you talk to young people around the issue and do it sensitively and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think language is very important. Yes, you mentioned body image there, which is kind of where I am at the moment. So I don't know if you've read or seen any of my stuff, but I'm being quite open at the moment, and I've been doing the rounds a bit with interviews and stuff about eating disorders for men, but for body dysmorphia as well. Because they're the two main things that I've suffered from and still do suffer. But now I know body dysmorphia is technically classed as a mental health condition, but it is obviously, as you know more than me, is closely linked to eating disorders. Do you find, or have you found, that there's much talk about eating or about body dysmorphia? Because when I mention it, a lot of people don't know too much about it. And I've only been able to put a label on that in the last while. Before 6 months ago, I'd never even heard of it. And although I now know I've been suffering for 20 years. Is there much talk about body dysmorphia?
We certainly do get questions about it, I should say, including from journalists and the media. And I think, to be strictly correct, it is more of an anxiety issue. That's where it fits in diagnostically.
Okay.
Kind of in terms of how it sits in the diagnostic manual and that kind of thing. And We know there's a very strong link there with OCD and the compulsive component, and that applies to both body dysmorphia and eating disorders. And we know as well about 12 to 15% of people who would be patients for plastic surgery or kind of dermatology procedures would potentially fit the kind of diagnosis of body dysmorphia.
Yeah. So do you offer any services for body dysmorphia, or is it mainly just eating disorders? I mean, what I mean by that is, like, if someone said, they came to you with body dysmorphia, would it be more therapy, more, as you said, like OCD, so it would be more therapy, really, would it?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think, again, there's things like CBT would be up there very much as well for body dysmorphia. And I know there's a group as well that's called OCD Ireland, who provides support based around that, because there's something else as well. There's another condition where people kind of tend to pull out their hair.
Yeah. Yes.
Another kind of anxiety piece as well.
Yeah. Okay. What would the percentage be for men and women that would come to yourselves? Would you find it's more women, or would it be 50-50, or?
It's hard to put, I suppose, an exact number on it. And let's start with the kind of the old statistic you would hear from men in eating disorders more generally would have been 1 in 10. And we know that figure is kind of out of date, really. It doesn't really fit with what people are seeing on the front line. And the more correct figure is potentially 1 in 4. And men and eating disorders have been very much kind of overlooked over time. So their issues have been under-researched, under-treated, under-diagnosed, under-recognized. We know less than 1% of all research around body image issues and eating disorders has actually focused on men. So we have a huge kind of deficit of knowledge around men and eating disorders. So we're a long way short of where we need to be.
Yeah.
And I think, in fairness, that is changing quite a lot. When I started working in the area, you kind of were aware there was a bit of a recognition and a conversation, but we have to really, I think, tip our hats to people like Scott Griffiths in Australia, the Stuart Murray, Jason Nagata, Kyle Ganson, all in the United States or North America. They've all really kind of taken this issue and said, look, there needs to be a lot more done here. There are no medical guidelines based around men's needs. A lot of the clinical tools, the assessment tools have been based around female presentations. I was at a webinar just there in July with a man with personal experience in the UK. He talked about being given pink leaflets with information about periods. So, that's kind of a little bit where things are at. That can sound quite stark and quite bleak. And I don't think it's necessarily about blaming the system as such. It's just that things haven't fully adapted to meet all of the different presentations of eating disorders, because just there's a big historic gap there. And another gap that actually comes up, well, two really. So firstly, we know 200,000 studies have been published on depression, only about 15,000 on eating disorders. So that's a massive information gap that, of course, affects the whole field.
Yeah.
It's the front line and our knowledge base. And then the other piece is the funding for research just falls far short compared to issues like schizophrenia, autism, and Alzheimer's. So unfortunately, that's kind of quite a negative picture of what I've just said around where we're at. But look, I think definitely those voices I've mentioned, people like yourself, there's a couple of men I know in the UK are quite active as well, are posting things. And now I've just seen over the last while, there's one of the diagnostic kind of tool, they kind of check for muscularity, and that's kind of a bit more born with men in mind. So I think the long-term picture is we'll see better tools to recognize the issues that men are experiencing, and they won't kind of be put into a female box. And even actually thinking back to the diagnostic criteria, one of them was the lack of menses, lack of menstruation. And that's obviously something men who identify as male can't experience. So that was taken out of the criteria in 2013, I think partly as a recognition that, men can still get an eating disorder, even though they don't obviously experience periods and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, oh my God, I was not aware of all that, because a lot of people do ask me, and obviously I'm not qualified to answer a question like that. You obviously are. And like, as you said, bleak. I don't want to use the word bleak again, but that's actually, we're way behind, a lot further behind than I thought. Would funding be, as you said a minute ago, like would that be a big kind of stumbling block, or is there more to it than that? And what I mean by that is like for research and stuff.
I think definitely. I mean, when you hear that gap, it's just there's just no comparison. In now, it's international research, so it's in dollars, and of course, it affects what gets published, and then how much of it hits the front line, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what the primary reason is for the funding.
Yeah.
Gap as such.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's move on from that one. So, stigma. We're slightly moving on. Stigma is a big thing that I have found, especially from men. And I mean, we're not just here to talk about men, obviously it's women as well. But I've certainly found stigma in men, especially anyone who's contacted me through my social media and through my website, from the interviews that I've done and stuff, is that's the one main thing that people say to me, is that the stigma. And that's why most men that I have spoken to or have reached out to me want to remain anonymous, is because of the stigma. Do you find that when people might come to yourselves, or just in general, maybe women as well, or probably more men?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think not just men, but certainly adults, regardless of gender as well. There's a piece there around the whole disclosure thing and just opening up. And I think for men with an eating disorder, there is an extra bit of a hurdle there around just opening up and sharing, and kind of, well, firstly, also recognizing sometimes that they have an issue. That can be a challenge first.
Yes.
Kind of a slow burn piece. And yeah, it's really tricky because, and I've noticed this really during COVID as well, around one of the issues faced by people with eating disorders is they're constantly aware of other people's perception of the illness. And a lot of that sometimes, unfortunately, is because the other people, whether it's family, wider family, or friends, have the perception that the food and weight are the primary issues. So if there's any change in the person, then the person is kind of having that feedback and receiving it, but also trying to get a sense of what other people might be thinking about them. And look, for anyone putting their hand up and saying they're struggling with this is very, very hard. And even the first GP appointment can be very hard. And just developing that wider kind of support network. And so my colleague Harriet would often talk about this idea of men having a double stigma. So the stigma of having an eating disorder, but then on top of that, you have the stigma of being a man with an eating disorder, because I think there's been so much just outside in the general public where people mightn't have much knowledge, might only have a superficial understanding of the issue, and kind of the sense of it being a female issue or a female illness. And sometimes it affects families as well. Like when we've done our family program, there was one time we did it and the gender split was 50-50. So half of the parents who were coming were supporting a son, and the other half were supporting a daughter. And it kind of just took a while, I think, for it to sink in with them.
Yeah,
men and boys can be experiencing eating disorder too.
Yeah, because I mean, like for me, I used to always hear, "Oh, there's not a pick on you," and I'd be like, "Yeah, but it's like you don't see that in yourself." So for me, it would always be where the body dysmorphia would come in as well. There was lots of different things I didn't like about myself, but for the eating disorder, where part of it would be the spare tire around my waist, you'd always hear, "There's not a pick on you." I mean, I always knew I had an issue with it, but I never spoke about it for 20 odd years. Okay, I've only put a label on it recently, but that doesn't mean I didn't know I had a problem, and as you said, it was the stigma with it as well. Being a man, and even just saying, like, even the words eating disorder, for me anyway, I don't know about you, but like when I first came out to start talking about this recently, I was contacted by someone quite close to me. "You don't have an eating disorder, you never did." So I suppose you can hide it quite well, but even that, I'm kind of like, when your people close to you are telling you don't, just the words eating disorders, I think usually resonate, maybe not resonate's the wrong word, but they're more it's more of a female term, I think. That's just my opinion anyway. Like for a man to say an eating disorder, I think a lot of people probably just think it's either, anorexia or bulimia. But obviously, and that's another question I wanted to talk about, the different types of eating disorders. So for me, it was binge eating disorder. How many different types of eating disorders are there?
I think most people would have a general kind of sense of familiarity with anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, and then binge eating disorder was only formally recognized in 2013, again back when the diagnostic criteria changed. And then there's also OSFED. So OSFED is other specified feeding or eating disorder, and that's a little bit where kind of people experience symptoms from more than one, so they don't quite meet the criteria for one specific one, but their symptoms might overlap between others. And that was kind of a new name again from 2013 of what was previously called EDNOS. So EDNOS would have been eating disorder not otherwise specified, again as a kind of a mixed piece of symptoms. And then finally there's also ARFID, which is a little bit tricky to explain, and I would say there's kind of low public recognition there. So that's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and it's slightly different in its clinical presentation because it doesn't have that kind of body image piece to it or the compulsion, but there are significant risks to that around developmental growth and all that, and a very limited food intake. And I always remember it kind of by a couple of different hallmarks. So the one piece can be like a lack of interest in food. Right. And the second piece can be a fear of a consequence of eating, and that could be something like choking. And then there can be a real sensory texture side of things as well. So anything across kind of sight, smell, that kind of side of food. So ARFID is a little bit different in that the body image piece isn't there and the drive for thinness isn't there, but it's certainly, it's coming on the radar a lot more, I think, in recent years. And I know there's a new book actually coming out on it soon, so it's a growing area, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So the main, I suppose the most popular three, I don't like to use the word popular, would be the anorexia, bulimia, and I suppose the binge eating one. Would they be? I suppose when people kind of come to yourselves, would they be the main three that people would mention?
It's like the question is sometimes what's the most common one, and it's kind of hard to answer. Yeah. Definitely in clinical practice, I think the most common is anorexia, but then in the general population, it's more likely to be binge eating. So it varies, and then in research, it's actually OSFED. So there's kind of no one set answer to which is the most common.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So if a question that I get asked a lot, and again, I'm not qualified to answer this, so I always try and not steer away from it, but I'm always wary about answering. But if someone felt they had a problem, what would be their first steps? So again, I said maybe the answer might be different for men and women. Or would your answer be the same?
I think it's the same, really, and it's really hard in a sense, because as much as I can say, send an email or contact a helpline or join online support group, I suppose we would find there has to be a kind of a sense from the person that things want to change for them.
Yeah.
And I'm always very clear then, if I'm speaking to the media or to journalists, that around recovery and treatment, that the person has a voice in their own treatment. So if they feel something isn't working, they can put their hand up and say, look, I don't feel this is working. Can we try something else? So that's really important as well. And it's very hard to say, I suppose in addiction, I think they tend to talk about rock bottom. And I don't know if we'd use that as much, but we do know sometimes things just get to quite a significant kind of crisis point, and can be for the person. They realize they just can't manage this anymore, either in general, but also on their own. And because of something then also called the eating disorder voice, which it's not a hallucination type voice, to be clear about that, but it's kind of like there are two parts of the person's head. So there's kind of the rational side and the voice side, and the voice will always kind of want the person to do more eating disorder things than allowing the person to get better and to get help. And I think it's just about that first contact with the GP, and because the term that comes up a lot, I suppose, as well, is the vicious cycle. Yeah. So it's trying to break that first chain in the link of the eating disorder. And like, it's very slow with recovery, and you're talking months and years potentially. You can't put a gun to someone's head and make them recover. You can't foist recovery on someone. And as well as, it's not just all the physical stuff that needs to be addressed, but they're the underlying issues. And sometimes I've heard people being asked about their experience, and they've been through recovery, and the question they're asked is, how's your relationship with food now? And sometimes the question that gets missed sometimes is, how's your relationship with yourself?
Yes.
Because it's going to be that one that determines a lot of the other stuff that's going on. So
yeah, that's brilliant. That's exactly it. Because I suppose if you're not feeling right in yourself, look, I'm only speaking personally here, the binge eating would come into it. You know, you have the comfort eating or the emotional eating. And as you said about the vicious cycle, look, the name of my podcast is The Endless Spiral. It's just another way of phrasing that. That's where I got the name from, because I'm exactly the same. I always felt I was in an endless spiral. So trust me, I can relate to exactly what you're saying. So if someone felt, or if someone was ready to reach out, you mentioned the GP, say they weren't ready to go to a GP, say, look, a man leaves everything, you know, especially going to a doctor, would they just going to maybe go to your website and fill out a form, or pick up the phone, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose if there is that fear of approaching a GP, maybe it can be useful as well just to write stuff down of things you want to discuss. Now, I know obviously because of the times we're in, it might then face-to-face appointments. I'm not sure what the lay of the land is there at the moment, or if all GP appointments are over the phone and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So they could probably, and the reason why I'm asking that is because, as we mentioned earlier on about men, and I know I keep going back to men all the time, but a lot of the time they want to remain anonymous, and so they can, like, you can obviously remain anonymous at the beginning, just going onto your website and just contacting yourselves, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. That's definitely an advantage, I suppose, of having that kind of confidentiality piece around services. And
yeah. Right, we'll wrap this up fairly soon. I just had another question, just going back to what we were talking about a minute ago. If you recognize in yourself there was something wrong, but what if you recognize in a family member? And as you said, obviously you can't put a gun to someone's head, but what would, say you're worrying about your child or your parent or your brother or whoever, what would their first steps be?
Sorry, it keeps coming up. My internet connection is unstable. Is it okay?
Yeah, you're perfect. Yeah, you're perfect.
Right. Okay, so it's very hard in those early days, and I suppose a lot of it then as well, how did you discover it? Did the person come to you, or did you notice things over a period of time? And in those early days, I think what you have to try and do is just figure out a way of how you're going to approach it. And it's about not going in with a confrontation dynamic, not going in all guns blazing, because that's a fairly quick route into resistance and denial and the person shutting down and all that kind of thing. So I would tend to say, it's better to go into a situation with a bit of research and a bit of homework done, and don't go in blind. So you want to read up on the issue first, just try and get a handle on what's going on for the person, particularly things like the eating disorder voice and why the behaviors might be happening. So we would tend to focus on an eating disorder being a kind of a coping mechanism for a person.
Yeah.
And I think whatever stereotypes you've heard, or you might have heard anecdotally, just you have to throw them out the window and just try and focus on the person. And you want to try and find kind of a calm place where you can take a bit of time, where you're not going to be rushed, where things are, maybe the atmosphere is a bit easy and welcoming to speak to the person. And you're trying not to focus too much on the behaviors around what the person is doing, but get a sense of how they're feeling, and just exploring that conversation a little bit, and be mindful of your own expectations too. I think at the outset, keep your expectations kind of fairly modest.
Okay. Yeah.
That one conversation isn't necessarily going to change things, and just have kind of a rough plan in your head of the things you kind of want to say. And probably some of this is just because you've noticed certain red flags going on for the person, and then it's just trying to ask them how things are going, saying you've noticed things and you are a little bit worried. And then it's because you want it to be a collaborative kind of conversation, that maybe something will come out of it. And even if the person says no at that first conversation around getting help or going to a GP, you have actually just put out your hand and saying, look, there's a kind of an olive branch here, if you like.
Yeah. What would a few of those red flags be, Barry?
Yeah, so they'll cut across really different aspects of a person's life, because an eating disorder affects them kind of behaviorally, physically, mentally, and emotionally. So for young girls and women, there's obviously the loss of periods. That's potentially one. And I would say as well, trip to the bathroom kind of being a bit unusual or a bit kind of frequent for reasons that don't seem related to kind of going to the bathroom, if you like. There's also a big sense really that a person's personality has changed in some respects, so marked change in personality.
Okay.
I would say also there can be kind of a lot of black and white thinking in the person, that their thinking patterns can be quite rigid and fixed. Maybe things like over-exercising as well, packaging of food under the bed, that kind of thing. And I think the big thing with an eating disorder, really, in terms of kind of red flags, is things have deteriorated. That's what's the sense that has gone on. So something's gotten really difficult for the person, and their life is kind of curtailed in some way. So it's not all about the food side of things, but it's kind of the after effects of that. And maybe as well, sometimes the family meal situation, that can become quite fraught and stressful for people kind of all under one roof.
Yeah, brilliant. I totally, that's very well said. Barry, maybe we'll wrap that up now. Before we go, I just want to thank you again, Barry, for coming on, because like I said, it's a topic that's very personal to me. So I did have some questions I wanted to get out there and hopefully clarify some questions, because I get so many questions sent to me, and obviously I can't answer most of them. So I hope we've covered at least some of them in this podcast. Barry, obviously people can go to the website. So it's bodywhys.ie, isn't it? Or is it .com? So I should know that.
.ie, yeah.
.ie, and it's WHYS.ie, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah.
Can I say just an extra piece about men? Will I come on to it after? Or?
Yeah. No, go ahead now. Do it now.
Yeah, I suppose sometimes just I'm asked kind of why is there this increase in men, or what's going on with men? And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. And I don't think it's one thing really. And I would say boys and men are the untold stories of eating disorders, I think, first and foremost. Kind of touching back to what I said earlier about their needs being under-recognized. But I think what's happening is that there are different kind of cultural, social, and environmental factors all kind of running in parallel in the background and sometimes in the foreground. So we know from the Australian experience, for example, that in the past 2 decades plus, that risky behaviors around food and weight haven't really increased amongst men. We know popular culture, there's a lot of pressure around muscularity. It's not difficult to find body ideal imagery in the media for men. I think we also need to get rid of the idea that boys and men aren't body conscious. They clearly are. So, and for some men, that's body dysmorphia, body dissatisfaction, or an eating disorder. And there's definitely some of the researchers I mentioned earlier, there's something going on around protein and how that is marketed and available in food content and all of that kind of thing. And this kind of thing you should be paying attention to. And some people will pick up on that, unfortunately. So kind of all of those kind of social, environmental forces kind of coming together, heightened with other risk factors, then I think that's why we're seeing some instances of men in eating disorders, both in general and kind of on the rise. So it's not really one thing. That's kind of my sense of things.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the protein. Is that like, the tubs of protein? Are you talking about actual taking protein shakes, or do you mean protein in food? Or
I think it's a mixture of both. Yeah. And I was at a Canadian webinar a few months ago, and they really tipped into this. So it's both the market share for protein, what's called protein fortified food, where it'll kind of directly say on the label of the bottle or whatever X percentage of protein.
Right. Yeah.
And I suppose another piece we don't tend to see it much, but I know again from the Australian experience is the use of steroids, unfortunately. And again, the Australian experience would point to the increase there, but it's not that people are taking it for sports-based reasons. Most of them aren't. They're taking it for the bulking up. So
yeah, it's more of a visual thing, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And then we know the latest research from NUI in Galway is that more younger people have been trying to take a diet now than, say, 18, 19 years ago. So it's kind of those 4 or 5 factors, I think they're all just kind of crashing into each other, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Ray, for bringing those topics up at the end there, because there's some topics that I forgot to mention earlier on. I forgot to ask you about. So thanks very much for actually mentioning them at the end, because they're very important. It's very important to mention them as well. I mean, there's some things that you wouldn't even think about, but the fact that you've got, say, on TV, you've got Love Island and all these things on Instagram and all that type of stuff. So you mentioned that culturally and stuff like that. So thanks very much for making those topics, for bringing those topics up. I really do appreciate that, because, like I said, I get asked so many times, but like I said, it's great to have someone in your position who, you're an expert in this. So thanks very much for bringing them up. I personally, I'm thanking you anyway. So guys, obviously we mentioned the website. You can also get in touch with BodyWhys, or at least you can follow them on their social media channels. And these are on everywhere, aren't you? Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And it's just BodyWhys, isn't it?
That's it. Yep.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. I've got loads of stuff up on the website. So if anyone's looking for any information, tons of information up on their website. Honestly, God, it's tons of it. Is that it, Barry? Do you want to add anything else before we go?
Yeah, that's all, I think.
Brilliant. Right, brilliant. Right, guys, we're going to leave that there. Well, again, thanks very much, Barry, for coming on the podcast today. That was very, very interesting, fascinating, actually. We'll leave there, guys, and I'll be back again on another podcast very soon. So I'll see you all again very soon. Bye for now.